So, welcome to the third Sare for Senate New York Symposium. Tonight, we are joined by Richard Freeman of Executive Intelligence Review, the Economics Desk, Derrick Gibson, who is a candidate for governor of New York State in the 2022 election, who is also working on the opportunity zones of the Senator Scott and President Trump, and Dennis Speed of the LaRouche PAC Manhattan Project. And I'll just start by saying I wanted to do this discussion because New York City in particular, as the most important city of the United States, is in a horrific collapse, which was in a sense precipitated, or the catalyst was the COVID pandemic, but you have absolutely insane policies coming from Mayor de Blasio, but you've had policies over the years of looting the city, going back to a fight that the LaRouche movement was involved in the 70s against Felix Rohatyn and the Municipal Assistance Corporation, where in effect the functions of an elected government were taken over by a financial control board. And what you have right now is a situation where Broadway cannot function, probably won't be open again till, I don't know, the end of 2021. Lincoln Center is shut down. The city is very, very vacant. There were 1,348 people shot in New York City as of September 15th, 2020. That's more than double the same period in 2019. And as of that date, 320 people had been killed, but I think it's increased even just in the last few days. I think there were another 11 people shot. It's really hideous. As of May, 420,000 people had moved out of the city. I think it's much higher now, but it's very hard to get the figures. And in August, 87% of the restaurant owners had been unable to pay their rent. Some were paying partial payments, some were paying none at all. Maybe a third of the restaurants have left the city. I've heard figures of 2/3 say they're never going to come back once they close. It's really catastrophic and rather shocking. Jenny, if you could put up the picture of the subway car. This is what it looks like taking the subway in New York at 8:30 in the morning. Oops, there it is. During morning rush hour, if people can see that picture there, I was the only person in the subway car. This is, yikes. Yeah, that's the picture. It was very, very clean. They're doing a good job, the MTA. Two of the subway cars I got on this week had just been mopped and completely sanitized before I entered, but there's no one in them to appreciate this work. If you want to show the other picture, that's the subway car. Now show the inside of the subway station, which is a complete mess, horrible. And these are some of the things that would have to be done if we were going to get the city functioning. I don't think it's acceptable to just say, like after Hurricane Sandy, people said, well, no one should live in New Orleans because it's below sea level. Try telling that to the people living in Amsterdam. It's a major port city. New York City is a major city. It's an international city. It is very important. Mr. LaRouche created this the LaRouche Political Action Committee in New York City. Alexander Hamilton was doing all of his work there. George Washington was inaugurated there. It can't be allowed to fail. So I'm just going to stop there and let Richard Freeman say a few things about the question of the state of cities in the country, how to think about it, what could be done, and then following him we'll go to Derrick Gibson.
Thanks, Diane. The question of cities, of course, is the same thing as the question of the building of nations. We can see that, of course, in the situation of building of Alexandria, the building of Athens, and so forth. In the United States, the way to think of a city, I would think, is that you can't just take it as sort of an isolated little nice bubble planted in a particular place, either by a port or by a rail line, but rather everything about that city reflects the economic and productive potential of the nation. And the nation advances itself through the power of the city, the educated labor force, the productive powers of that. So that their two are together. You can't isolate one from the other. And in the United States, we've had early examples of the building of Boston, the building of Philadelphia, which of course Benjamin Franklin had a lot to do with, the post office, health services, and so forth. I wanted to just give a very quick indication of where some of our cities stand. Many of them, particularly those that were most industrial, are in the worst shape possible right now. And maybe if we have time later to indicate where we could build cities, 25 to 50 new cities, fully equipped. So if I could have the first graphic, please. What you're going to see is population of these cities by decade, but we'll notice some patterns. Okay, so we can look at this population of St. Louis, and two things that are interesting about this, and you're going to see this in two other cities. I picked a Midwestern city. St. Louis developed, if you see the little dot that says 1850, go one dot over, one little circle, and that's 1860. And then look at from 1860, 1870, 1880, 90, and the year 1900. In those 40 years between 1860 and 1900, St. Louis exploded in size and importance. Why? Because of Abraham Lincoln. Because Abraham Lincoln built the Transcontinental Railroad, built the tremendous level of economic development in the machine tool sector. He built various bridges like the Eads Bridge, built in 1874, that crossed the Mississippi not too far from St. Louis. And therefore, it set the basis. Again, if you think of a city as a reflection, or not a reflection, but as part of the development process of a nation, you see that it explodes as if that nation's economy explodes. And there are many features, the greenbacks, which was a Hamiltonian credit system. Back to St. Louis, let's look at where St. Louis has its high point. If we could show that. Okay, so we're going to look at 1950. And 1950, St. Louis has a little bit under 900,000 people. Today, St. Louis has about 360,000. So it's fallen by almost 2/3. 1950, the other great period of development in the United States, was the development under Roosevelt from 33, but also during the World War II economic mobilization from 1939 through 1944. And so you can see right at that top, that's where St. Louis stood. As America deindustrialized, particularly in the beginning with the taking of the dollar off of the gold standard, gold reserve system, and obliterating of Bretton Woods, as the industry, and this is a city that depends upon industry, was cut out from under it, you can see the fall of 2/3. Second city, please. Okay, same thing with Baltimore. You can look at Baltimore, which is a very important port in American Revolutionary times, but you can see in Baltimore about 220,000 during 1860, if you go one dot over from the 1850. And then look where it is by 1900s. It went up to 500,000 and more than doubled. As that thrust from the Lincoln thrust of that 1861 through 1897, we'll call it 1900 thrust, which was a long sustained wave of development, one of the greatest in America's history, one of the greatest in the world's history. That carried over until Baltimore nearly had 1 million people in 1950. Same process. Look at the second inflection point, 1950. And we now see that Baltimore's below 600,000. They've lost 400,000 people. This is third graphic, please. Okay, this is Detroit. Now this is amazing. I lived in Detroit for 3 years, helping work with our organization there. You can look at 1860, which is one dot over from 1850. You can look at 1900. Now that's already a tremendous growth of almost 2.5 times. However, as Detroit developed in the 30s and 40s, particularly as people tried, African Americans left the South to go to Chicago and Detroit, it grew, and it grew in the auto industry in particular, but many, many other industries. And you can see where it was in 1950. In 1950, it had above 1.8 million people. It was the fifth largest city in the United States. Today, it's down to 690,000. It's just precipitously dropped as America deindustrialized. So the lifeblood of a city functions within the process of the whole economy. And that's the way you have to sort of look at it. Next one, please. Okay, this is a little bit blurry, but you can see the dark line. That's the Transcontinental Railroad, the first one, and that was built in 1863. It was started, the Union Pacific, and it goes from Omaha, Nebraska, all the way out to San Francisco. Next one, please. Now, this is the rail map, and you'll see we didn't just build one transcontinental railroad. We actually built 6. Most people are not aware of that, but you can see the heavy lines also reflecting the traffic of the country. The last thing I just want to say about cities, just to locate this, is you cannot have a city. You must have certain features. One is health infrastructure. I want to mention New York because Colonel George Waring was the commissioner of street cleaning from early in 1895 to 1898. He was a veteran of the Civil War. He was a sanitation engineer. And his people used to wear white uniforms. They would get out every morning and clean the streets. And this was critical because if you think of the Anopheles mosquito and the elimination of that to deal with malaria and all those other features, you must have health systems. You can't have stagnant water. You also need hospitals. You also need electricity. You also need power. So when you talk about a city, if it's going to develop and if you're going to improve it, then those are the features you need. The last thing I would just leave people with as a thought is how are we going to deal with this? What are we going to do with Baltimore? Just let it sit there? Are we going to say too bad for Detroit? Or what Detroit's tried to become over the last 15 years, they call it cool Detroit, which is, it's cool because there's many of the houses have been ripped down and the wind just whips right through Detroit. And there's many factories no longer there. St. Louis, what are we going to do with St. Louis? So we have this question across the United States, and the process of city building, which Mr. LaRouche addressed many times, is the question of infrastructure, of education, of the increasing of the productive powers. And I would say cities should be integrated with industry. If you ever were to Detroit, there's not a contradiction between having factories and townhouses or decent homes. Those are the sorts of questions I would just throw out, because we do have to deal with New York and many cities that have completely collapsed. And it's not Democrat, Republican, it's neglect and deindustrialization over the last 50 years.
Great, thanks. So Mr. Gibson, if you want to tell people something about the opportunity zones, first of all, what they are, how they were started, and anything else you think people should know, because I think a lot of people may not be familiar with what the program is and what's happened already.
So, right, we have an opportunity zone designated in the state of New York, and I work directly with Federal Opportunity Zone, getting the funding, pairing people up with developers and so forth. At this point, New York State has a designated area around 496 tracts that is considered below the poverty rate, which is 49.6% in the state of New York itself. So the program was developed by Tim Scott, along with President Trump and a host of other people, such as Ben Carson. And what it does is give tax incentives to private citizen cooperation to invest into these low-income areas to bring them up to a standard of living like the rest the state of New York and America itself. But what happens in the op zone is directly designated from your governor. We had 500, and I think about 14 tracks that was identified, and the governor picked out 496, which is good. And also the governor has the power to designate about 5 or 6 more out that did not qualify. So it's up to the individuals to petition the governor and make that happen. So what we do, you would go on federal opportunity zones, and you will look it up and look up some property there that is designated. Maybe put an address in if you have an address. If not, you can see it on the overall map, the designated areas. And from there, you can contact myself, and all the people on my team, which is Gibson Bryant Williams Construction LLC, and consultant company. You can contact me directly, and I will get your paperwork. And what we do is shovel-ready projects. We don't just anybody just fall out the woodwork and say, I want to do this or do that. You have to come to the table with shovel-ready projects, and I get that funded for you. We have up to a month ago, we had about $75 billion in our private investors. And it's very few people taking advantage of this situation, because I'm sure they are uninformed, because the news media don't let the people know that this opportunity is out there for them. So what we do is we do a few lives. We go face to face and talk to people and let them know. So to saying that, if go on federal opportunity zones, look up the tracks that are designated for opportunity zone. And if you want to purchase, you can purchase, you can build from the ground up, you can remodel, you can buy, anything is available, but it's for mixed use. It's living quarters, shopping centers, whatever you want to put there. Entertainment also can be a part of the project. So what we are doing, just example, Jackson State in Mississippi, we are doing their project now. It's about $630 million that we are doing. We are closing on that real soon, probably about a day or two. And what they are doing is new dormitories at Jackson State in Mississippi. I'm sure all y'all are aware of the living conditions in Jackson State, and you probably won't live there yourself, because I wouldn't at the present moment. But the project includes a dormitory. It includes a lot of things for the school, cafeteria. Outside of the school system, we're going to have personal care homes, hotels, just anything to lift the city up. If you can imagine what you want your city to look like, we do that for you. So that is the project we're doing in Jackson, Mississippi. As you know, Deion Sanders, the Hall of Famer, former Atlanta Falcon and former Dallas Cowboy, was hired to be the head coach and the athletic director there. And things are moving pretty fast. So you can reach out to me on opportunity zones, and we'll get that funding for you, uplift your community, your neighborhood. There are some in the Bronx, New York, that is designated opportunity zone. The medium income, maybe it's about 52,000 over there. And you know, that's nothing living in the city of New York anyway. You'll starve to death. So we need to get the word out there. It is help out there for our communities, and we need to take full advantage of it.
Great. Well, maybe I'll just bring in Dennis. What you said gives me some ideas, and I think this could really be integrated with what Richard was talking about if we had a whole plan for the country. But Dennis, do you have some thoughts?
Well, Jackson State was mentioned. 50 years ago, May 15th, Jackson State entered national news because of the killing of 2 students on the campus there. This occurred 11 days after the Kent State killings of 4 students at Kent State University in Ohio. From approximately the time of these killings and the unrest that had occurred, this was largely around the war in Vietnam and other matters of social injustice. Discussions began about what should be done about the cities of America. And from approximately 1967 through now, large numbers of elective seats, elective office seats, city council, mayoral, state representative seats went to politicians, African American largely in many cases, but also Democratic Party politicians. And it was a half century that occurred in which there was a sort of mantra about rebuilding the cities. If you compare the physical state, including housing stock, and of course the transportation and other systems of cities, then and now, you'll find that in virtually every city of the United States, the situation is worse. And New York City is the most notorious of exceptions. The dictatorship, financial dictatorship, was established over New York City in 1975. The Municipal Assistance Corporation came into that time, and it was a 33-year charter going until 2008. The charter expired at the point that Mike Bloomberg, an actual banker, essentially, had become finally mayor over New York. New York went from being a city which had the largest industrial workforce in the United States, inclusive of Detroit, inclusive of Chicago. It was over 1 million persons associated in one way or the other, whether that meant the transportation industries or other elements, smaller shops around New York. You're looking at a circumstance right now, Diane already alluded to it, in which we could be seeing the decomposition of New York, that New York might go the direction that the once housing czar called Roger Starr had talked about. He talked about the idea of planned shrinkage of New York. This was in the 1970s, and discussed the idea that New York City should not be larger than basically 5 or 6 million people. Think where we are tonight is we're in an America where Republican or Democratic monikers, if you want to call them that, designations, don't themselves mean that much. What does mean something is, are we going to enact and embark upon a process of reconstruction? Are we going to start that now? Some of us associated with things like the LaRouche Political Action Committee and so on have had a program talking about the idea of hundreds of millions of jobs globally, in fact, 1.5 billion jobs globally, but in the United States, at least 50 million jobs. Of course, recently, during the COVID pandemic's height, we were at about 50 million unemployed. We still have a large number of unemployed and underemployed or misemployed. So I think some of the things that were being alluded to a few minutes ago concerning the opportunity zones and some other things are important to consider as part of a mixture of what needs to be done to look at what we call urban America. Urban America often is a substitute phrase for talking about Black America or brown America. And that's not only a mistake, it's in reversing that reference and then referring to the idea of the new advanced technologies of an eminently productive United States in mining, in manufacturing, and in agriculture. Remember that if you're talking about New Jersey or Long Island, these were agricultural areas 50 years ago. And the idea of a mixture of advanced technologies, or maybe a specialization in the case of New York City in healthcare, which is one way that you could appropriate all of the now increasingly vacant high rises and office buildings. You could create or use these as tiered structures for very, very advanced medical research and care facilities. And you could, in fact, establish New York City as a preeminent center for world healthcare. Between that and a rebuilding of particularly of the transportation grid of the Northeast, particularly with high-speed rail and magnetically levitated trains, the things you could do with that. I think one of the things that might be interesting is to ask either Richard Freeman or Diane, yourself, all of us, what we would take, Mr. Gibson might have some particular ideas about this, what it would take for us to redevelop America's cities. So, of course, we're in one, the preeminent city of America. But I just wonder if you gentlemen might have something to say. Maybe, Richard, if you have something.
Well, maybe I'd be happy to. Maybe Diane had some thought, and then I could go. Whichever way you want to do it.
Sure. I mean, I'll just say I was thinking in terms of what Derrick was saying. if you had a program that was fully integrated to develop the entirety of the United States, which involved a power grid, transportation grid, etc., and you combined it with these opportunity zones, because what you wanted, I mean, you look at, take for example, China, what they're doing. They've built, I don't know how many, tens of thousands of kilometers of high-speed rail. They're building entirely new cities. They're working with other countries like Egypt, which is about to build the second only high-speed rail on the continent of Africa. And they're talking about building a new city. But in the case of China, they had a goal. They wanted to eradicate poverty by 2020, and you can't, it's not guaranteed that just building infrastructure or building new industry, that you also are lifting people out of poverty. That doesn't necessarily follow. That you actually have to find the areas where people are impoverished and take steps to find out what the dynamic is there and to transform the economy, the culture, and everything. And it seems that what President Trump and Senator Scott are looking at is something very much like that, where you're actually looking to these areas and turning areas. This is what FDR did with the Tennessee Valley Authority in a big scale. He took an area that was horribly impoverished and backward and turned it into an industrial powerhouse for the nation. So it seems that there's a combination of these things together that could actually work to completely move the United States into a totally different paradigm in a way that people aren't probably even thinking about it. That's what comes to mind. I also have a thought about our friend Jose Vega's Space CCC and the Bronx for the opportunity zone there, but we can come back to that.
So Diane,
Yeah.
let me reiterate. We had 75 billion in the funds. Very few people were taking advantage of it. Like I said, they don't know about it. But now, about a month ago, I went and met President Trump, Dr. Carson, and so forth in Atlanta. And, they gave 500 billion more. So it's 575 billion that is in the pot. And the pot will constantly grow, once investors catch on to it. And I know they can get this tax write-off, tax breaks or whatever. So they're chomping at the bits to do this. So what we have to do is get the word out and start doing these things, because the high-speed rail system is needed. If we can do most of those op zones is upstate, we need to get those up and going, and it can employ people from New York City. You can take the high-speed rail and you can be back home for lunch or dinner or whatever, on the high-speed rail. So we got to work towards that. Building the whole entire state of New York up would be a great thing, but without that transportation and infrastructure that we need, it's not going to work, and people still going to be like jobs or whatever. So we need to try to put the word out, and there's some guys I spoke to have some good plans. They're trying to do the high-speed train from Atlanta to Mississippi. They got all the workings there, something that New York State need to copy for our upstate project to connect it with the city, and try to get the business to come back by lowering them with, tax breaks for a good little while, because they are the ones that create jobs, therefore create more taxpayers. So we need to discuss this all around. Op zone can be the flower that blooms over the whole entire United States of America and bring everyone together and lift people out of poverty.
Yeah, Rishi, let me just ask you in response actually to what Mr. Gibson just said, what do you think, take New York. Of course, you have the sort of wreck of the present infrastructure inside of the city. But then if you look at Buffalo to New York City, of course, Albany to New York City, Buffalo to Albany, you're talking about distances that in the case of the high-speed rail that's used in something like a place like China could change the travel between, let's say, Buffalo and New York from 7 hours to something like 2.5 or 3 maximum. And I just would like to ask you, because I guess you've thought about this a lot, what kind of obstacles are you dealing with in older cities where you've got dilapidated infrastructure, but at the same time you have these opportunities we've just been hearing about? How would you approach dealing with that kind of circumstance?
Sure, sure. Great question. I'd like to approach it just by looking at one thing different and then come back because I think it'll give the setting. If we could have the last graphic, it's building new cities, and then I'll show you why I think it's very much related to what we have to do. Picking up what you said and what Derrick said. So if we could have the last graphic, Jenny, please. Okay, this is the United States, and it's, no, that was correct. Thank you. And it's 2010, and its population density. The darkest red is 530 people per square mile. And then it grades down to about 210. It's still kind of reddish pink. And then it grades down to 50 per square mile and then 0 per square mile. So if you look at an area that is east of the Mississippi, you'll see a lot of places that don't have anybody living there. Now, there's the historical reasons. One was that Teddy Roosevelt decreed that we would not build things in the early 1900s in these areas. We would put them aside for nature reserves, that we would call them conservancies today and so forth. Let's say we build 50 cities in this area. What do you need? And this gets to the high-speed rail that Mr. Gibson and Dennis both raised. But to build a city today, you would not want to just go and string some lines up and things like that, nor just have a little zone and let it develop. And the Chinese don't do that. Urban renewal, one of the problems of urban renewal, they just said, you have your city, here's some money, and you just grow it some way. But there has to be an organized way that you do it. What LaRouche proposed about 50 years ago, and it was working on, is you build modular units in a city. You build electricity grids, modular, you install them. Just like you can build hospitals in Wuhan, modular units. You build water systems, modular water systems. You build modular other features. You put some of the traffic underground. You don't have to put it above ground. You have railroads that can go underneath, breakdown facilities, bulk breakdown, and they're sent to somewhere else across the country. These should be high-speed railroads, as Mr. Gibson is indicating. You can have electrified rail, which will travel at about 200 to 220 miles per hour. You can have magnetically levitated rail, which works on electric currents, has no wheels, and travels up to the range of 300 to 310 miles an hour. That means a trip from, say, for instance, New York City to Detroit is less than 2 hours. And you can send manufacturing components. You would build in the same unbuilt zone a large amount of water. And one of the proposals that we have been espousing for 40 years is the North American Water Power Alliance. You take water from the Tanzania and the Yukon rivers all the way up in Alaska, bring it down through the Rocky Mountain Trench, then bring it down, and you can also take it across eastward, and you fill up the water aquifers and so forth, like the Ogallala Aquifer, that's critical to Nebraska, and take it all the way down into Mexico. This starts to replenish the water. We can use nuclear power, and there's been initiatives by the Trump administration in this direction, and of course, fusion power. And therefore, if you do that, and this is a rough, off-the-cuff estimate, so you take it for what it's worth. I figure this is about $250 trillion of development, not 250 billion, 250 trillion. Money is not the concept. It's developing the powers of the mind of the citizens, the powers of their ability to raise themselves up. And one point that Derrick made, which was really excellent, look, you don't live in $50,000. You can't do that. Family of four, it doesn't happen. You're already paying $17,000 for rent if you take the average rent of $1,435 for the country. Now, one of the conditions I just want to mention is that in the United States, 1 out of 3 people who are wage earners earn less than, yeah, that's the North American Water and Power Alliance proposal. 1 out of 3 people earn less than $20,000. 45%, and includes the 1 out of 3 people I just mentioned, but 45% earn less than $30,000. It did not improve much under President Trump, but it's not President Trump. This was true for Obama. This was true for Bush. This goes back to Clinton. We have to address that. We have to give human beings the ability to be productive in this. Now, to answer Dennis's question, Well, if we can do these things with modular units, could we apply it to the older cities? The ones, Detroit, Baltimore, St. Louis, New York, Philadelphia, and so forth? The answer is absolutely. It's going to take a little bit of creativity because you have to figure out how to do it. Boston tried something called the Big Dig, where there were problems with it because some of it was just speculative, but they tried to build under the city a new roadway system while not disrupting the current city that exists. I think if we bring apart the scientists and others and engineers and put them to work with this sort of thing, we can figure out how to do it in the South Bronx, in Watts, in you name it, the third ward of New Orleans. We can do it anywhere in the country. It's a matter of commitment, and we couple that with the space program, the fusion development program, the NWAPA, which you just saw the map of. You make it one integrated process, and now the cities become powerful. They're not just eyesores where people are just trapped, but they become powerful as part of a national and actually galactic development system. So I would say to Dennis's question, develop the science, figure this out. We can do that. There are already lots of suggestions. Get the high-speed rail in there. We've proposed 42,000 miles of high-speed rail in the United States, electrified, to 92 different cities that would link the whole United States. And part of that development, take that sort of approach.
Well, you're talking about power, water, transportation, and housing. Clearly, also communications networks, of course, as well. So now, when you used figures before about hundreds of trillions of dollars, but let me ask this question. What do you, for example, let's take again the New York State area. What are we talking about in terms of translated job equivalents?
I would have had to look at that to give you a full honest answer, Dennis, because I don't have those numbers. But I think what we could do, this would provide work. I think, I'm not going to guess, but I think that New York State has at least well, no, it must have much more. I would say it probably has about 8 to 9 million workers. We would change the quality of what they do so that instead of trying to sell trinkets on the streets of New York or here, get this gold watch for 50 cents, you're putting them they have something that they can build and they can turn to their children and say, I built that. And I think we would transfer within that 9 million. I apologize, but I don't know the exact figures. I would say probably only about 1/5 is manufacturing or transportation or mining or construction. That's what we call goods producing. We should shift that to 50%. Get it up to 50% and another 5 to 10% in research and development. That would mean that if those 9 million were only 1/5 now, they would be 3/5. And I believe that these jobs that we would create, the new ones for rebuilding the cities and so forth, we don't have enough people. We simply don't have in the United States or New York State enough people, even if we took everybody to work. And we want to make sure people are getting education. We don't want kids kicked out, but they can learn. They can get on-the-job training, and that's an excellent thing in an apprenticeship program. We would need probably, I would think, another 3 to 8 million people by the year 2040, 2045. So, and that, again, I don't have the figures in front of me, so I apologize, I might be off. But that's the type of thinking, and it is true. If my figures are off, the concept is valid. It's just, so I think we are talking about bringing into the productive labor force, initially about 4 to 5 million, that's a transfer out of what they're doing now, and another 3 to 4 million who would be newly created in the productive labor force by whatever means we increase our population.
You know,
it's rough.
As you're talking about this, I'm thinking about a situation that has been discussed recently by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, which is the situation in Africa where 7 million people have already starved to death. You're facing imminent starvation of 30 million people. And I think people often tend to think, oh, well, we're in such terrible shape. How can we help someone else? Aren't you supposed to look out for yourself first? This kind of thing. When actually, if part of the mission of the United States, and you can also take the state of New York, which has enormous amounts of dairy farms and other kinds of agriculture and also industry, say, well, what would it take to actually solve this problem, both in the immediate short term and in the longer term? Because part of what the pandemic has exposed is what you said, the composition of our workforce is actually insane. We have so little of the population involved in physically producing anything, and our basic infrastructure is so far decayed that the slightest crisis, whether it's a storm, a pandemic, civil unrest, or what, it disrupts everything. Everything gets dislocated, and you get kind of a domino effect. And there's all this talk about sending people checks, stimulus checks, and so on, people who are unemployed. This is needed, but what if you said, well, look, we want to pay you. There's going to be a stimulus, but we need, 20,000 people from New York City to actually fulfill the following functions. And you can think of any kinds of things that need to be done, whether it's more people involved in sanitation, people going upstate to work on various things, people building extensions onto the schools so you have more space to do socially distanced classes. And to break up these bottlenecks in the farming, where you have these meat packing plants, which are run by these giant conglomerates, and these smaller ones, which are much more efficient, or can be much more efficient, actually are allowed to function or are bolstered. It just seems to me there would be a way of reconfiguring the workforce we have now, and say you take something that will really inspire people. I think Americans would be thrilled and inspired to feed Africa, to say we're going to intervene and not let 30 million people die. And I was going to school, but my school is shut down, so I'm going to go out to a dairy farm and work with the farmers in upstate New York and figure out how to do something about this. I think you could get an extraordinary mobilization, which would change the skill set of the population and begin to give you a foot in the door in terms of changing the whole economy in the way that we need to.
Yeah, I think also, I mentioned to Diane and Derrick, and just think of the Schenectady, which had GE plants, Rochester, Buffalo Belt. And you could be producing all sorts of things for Africa, power plants, units like that, tractors. You can learn how to convert plants. We've got 28,000 plants, 30,000 plants that have shut down, physical factories since 2003. Let's reopen them. Let's start reconverting them like we did during World War II for a war production. Let's reconvert them to produce all these goods for Africa, for Ibero-America. We will open up all sorts of possibilities. And some of the plant and equipment is run down, okay, but some of it's perfectly good, and you could bring new equipment in and repurpose it for exactly the sort of purpose that you're referencing.
Well, I have something as a question. Actually, I know that we also had another question that came in, but I have something here, Richie. Is it from a book called "Who Owns the Future" by Jaron Lanier? And at one point, he asked this question. He says, "Here's a current example of the challenge we face. At the height of its power, the photography company Kodak employed more than 140,000 people and was worth $28 billion. Now, some of you know Kodak, of course, was located up in Rochester, New York. They even invented the first digital camera. But today, Kodak is bankrupt, and the new face of digital photography has become Instagram. When Instagram was sold to Facebook for $1 billion, in 2012, it employed only 13 people. Where did all those jobs disappear to, and what happened to the wealth that those middle-class jobs created?" So I pull that in because, of course, one of the things that's a haunting background image is automation, computers, et cetera, have taken all of the jobs. And so forth and so on. But what you're actually outlining just demonstrates that there's plenty of, not only is there plenty of work for people, but there's work in advanced forms of technology and so forth and so on. If you could say something about that, because I would think I would be wondering about that if I were listening.
Yeah, I think if factories move towards using robots and so forth, that's fine if it prevents advanced technology. Look at every phase of America's development. We no longer use wood to make rails. We use steel. Did we decrease employment or increase employment? We increased. Every time you move up the scientific and technological ladder, you will lose some things. Although we should not have lost some of the jobs that we've lost in upper New York State. Look at Buffalo as a steel town. And it was just shut. The steel industries, we had a picture in 1981 of them blowing up. You can see like they cleared everyone else out and then they blew up steel factories because they said we had too much steel. That's nuts. I mean, we could use, we produce about 87, 88 million tons of steel a year. We could probably use about 150 to 160 million tons of steel. We could revitalize these places with that. If we use more advanced technologies, fine. We will find new things. We have a whole science industry for space. And let me just remind people, because people do know about the Artemis from Diane's, tremendous campaign, the Artemis program to go to use Moon to actually as a base to go to put the first woman and the next man on Mars, which is a program that Lyndon LaRouche kept alive in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when very few people were talking about it. But the thing is, that is going to require all sorts of industries. We could probably triple, quadruple the size of NASA, but the industries, if you remember what happened when we did Apollo, around Boston, that technological belt, in Detroit, in Ohio, in California, lots of shops said, look, this is growing. What do we have to do to become part of NASA? All right, find out from them. They have people like Derrick was recommending. He has people he will refer you to talk about this program. People went in and said, oh, okay, we could build that. So that it created an imaginative place that a lot of these things will be spun off at a much higher level. So you can't exactly predict the next level, but it's not a threat from automation. It's just incorporating man's advanced scientific principles, which you put into a machine, and just figure out a new matrix of industries. I mean, we're no longer making candle makers and shoesmiths, which used to be the dominant industries in 1790. That matrix has changed. But the key thing is, are we committed to that process of development?
Did you see the question, Diane? There's a question that came in. Somebody said, the old completely to rebuild them. Is that they're asking it's a better approach?
Right.
All over?
I couldn't hear exactly what you said, Dennis, but I saw the question about whether it's necessary to demolish the old cities to rebuild. No, in fact, our friend, I mean, some things you may want to demolish and they may not be the oldest things. They might be the new, really ugly things. And forgive me, but I think Hudson Yards is really hideously ugly, but maybe we could turn it into homeless shelters or something. But Hal Cooper, our late friend who was an expert on rail, thought that the situation in Manhattan, for example, you might have to build the new subway system underneath the current subway system. I mean, you have this funny thing because it's like fixing a clock while it's still running. Certain kinds of infrastructure that people depend on, you can't just take it out of commission and repair it. You have to keep it functioning and figure out how to build the new. So I think we have a lot of engineers in this country who are immensely talented. I think their thinking has been somewhat stunted because they keep getting told we don't have money, we don't have money, we don't have money, and then they start thinking smaller and smaller. But if they were unleashed to actually consider these things, they would have innovative ways of solving many of them. And actually, I'd be curious to know what Derrick has to say about that potential, because I suspect also maybe part of what you're running into is that it's been so many decades where people have not been allowed to build or encouraged to even think of new. You think of how little new infrastructure there is. I put a post up on Facebook today on the American Society of Civil Engineers, their report on the bridges in New York. I think we have, out of 17,000 bridges in New York, 2,000 of them are precarious. I'll put it that way. They need to have constant attention to make sure that they don't collapse. That's somewhat alarming.
Riding through the city, I was speaking on that just yesterday and looking up at the rail system, how the rust and how it's decaying right in front of your eyes. And I was like, I'm really afraid to drive under here. It may collapse at any moment. Hope a train don't come. But yeah, the young lady, whoever asked from Jennifer asking the question about we wouldn't need to demolish the entire city to rebuild. Absolutely not. You know, we have plenty of space, plenty of land, and and within the opportunity zone, these are mostly non-populated areas. We need to build out. We need to build our cities out and not continue to try to rebuild. Of course, we got to modernize the city itself, but we got to expand, as Dennis was saying, and create more cities. And you can build those cities without inconvenience the mass of people living in New York City. And once you get that done, then we can come back and concentrate on the old city and bring it up to date. That's what I was on the lines that I'm thinking a way that we could get this done in a timely fashion, in a timely manner, if we think like that and go ahead on and think outside the box. Let's design another city with this, that, or whatever, and come back. So those are the lines that I myself are thinking on. And I think we all need to do that because New York City, just for instance, is, you know, it's huge. Structural wise, it's huge, and it's a lot of damage. Like Diane was saying, you're going to inconvenience a lot of people. Therefore, you have to build up under the rail system, and that may not be good either. So I think at this point, we need to start encouraging people to be outside and upstate, and try to get the rail system so people can move upstate, and then they have access to the city. For instance, Hyperloop, I looked at Hyperloop for a while. That would be the perfect transportation if it came into play, if somebody brought it into play. It had been discussed several times. But let's build new cities is my thought. Let's get those new cities built, and then let's double back and then upgrade the cities that we are living in, all the while doing infrastructure work on them also while we're doing the new city, and it won't inconvenience so many people.
Yeah, just to say something to echo that in part, if you take the area, part of it is the Meadowlands, but part of it is also just parallel of the Palisades in New Jersey. You could build a city the size of Manhattan, or areas the size of Manhattan, probably far more cheaply. And in any case, much of that was being done right after 9/11 anyway, in a very haphazard way. Whereas if you had an actual overall plan, particularly with respect to things like your high-speed rail, there are a couple of different possible alternatives you have. Not that you're going to completely empty New York out, but there's an interesting way that you might look at it if you actually took a look at a map. There are areas of the Bronx, for example, which are completely vacant. Not because everything was blown up, just because they're vacant. There's areas of Brooklyn which are completely vacant. So you may be able to, at least temporarily, build completely new capabilities in these areas, move people sort of in both directions, east and west, but out of some of the worst of the areas, and in fact, just blow up a lot of it. That might make people quite happy, actually. So we may not be talking about blowing up everything. No, of course not. Nobody here is advocating nuclear war, but I think it might be interesting to really get some people debating this and organizing and agitating, and then thinking about all of the different fighting that would go on. But if it were about this rather than transgender cows or something, I think Americans might get a lot more interested in the future.
One thing on what you were saying, Dennis, yes. If you think about it, there's ways of transmitting. There's it's called cryogenic or different names, but you can get the temperatures of down on electrical wires and elsewise. It used to be you had to take it to negative 273 degrees Celsius, but they found ways of not having to take it down so far. This is a fascinating feature because you will use it in maglev. It will reduce the resistance in your wires. It can also be used for transmission lines, and the Chinese have talked about building 1,000 miles of this, 1,000 kilometers, that would be about 600 miles, and testing it out, which, because you're going to be making it very cold, you will not lose. Transmission lines will lose anywhere from 5 to 9 to 11% of the electricity. With step down and step up transformers and things like that, you would not lose it. You could also put liquefied natural gas, because you can liquefy it at these very, very cool temperatures. This is, it's used in superconductivity. So there's all sorts of things. Cities, there's two ways that people can think about cities. It's terrible, just terrible. Okay, fine, it's true in some aspects of it. But they're also cultural centers, and they can become the instigators of thinking of how you take the most advanced processes and regenerate the cities, and maybe, as Derrick and you are saying, Dennis, move out first, come back in. You can take down some of the parts that people have places to live if they have housing, but you can make these they can become like a space program. And there's no reason we can't apply the most advanced processes to rebuilding cities, which is a national goal. And unfortunately, you can see this sometimes in the debates that go on when people run for office. They leave that out. They sort of bypass it, and they'll say something about this or something about that. But that's a question that is soluble. And you could build cities that would start to look like Florence. No reason we can't. But we could definitely do that in places like New York State, Palisades, New Jersey. I think that's what you were recommending or citing. This is the sort of thing that can be completely. It can lead to several scientific leaps.
Great. This is really interesting. I think we have to have another discussion. We should begin to wrap up right now. And I thought maybe as we do that, Derrick, you might, for people who weren't on in the beginning, reiterate what the opportunity zones are. I certainly had no idea that they now have that amount of funding available. And then if Richard and Dennis have closing remarks also.
Thank you, Diane. So Federal Opportunity Zone, like I was speaking on earlier at the beginning of the show, it's a project that was put together by Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina and President Trump, Dr. Ben Carson, and others. It is a program that is designed to uplift the low-income area in your state or in your city. These areas are designated by the governor himself. New York State, once again, had 500 and I believe about 14 tracts identified. The governor picked 496 of those areas to be designated as the Opportunity Zone. And also, President Trump gave them the opportunity, even the ones that didn't qualify for the Opportunity Zone, your governor can pick those areas also to qualify for that area himself. So you have to get with your governor and petition your governor, whatever. But what is most important is take advantage of these areas now. We have 500 in total, $575 billion sitting in the pot waiting on you to invest into your community. You don't have to be a contractor, developer, or whoever. You have to have an idea and you have to get it shovel ready. You can partner up with a developer or whoever, and you can get your project done. Like I said, it's mixed use development. So we need to concentrate on that. And let's get this, get these things done. Then we can concentrate on fixing our city, New York City, which is falling apart completely. But let's look in those areas. Let's start. Let's take advantage of this program that few people know about. Let's get the word out to everybody. Shout it out to everybody. And you can contact me. You can reach my team. Let me give you that number because Facebook took me down today. So you can't get me on Facebook, but you can get me on Twitter at Gibson for New York State Governor. You can DM me and we can get you the fund. I can kind of guide you through that. I'm gonna give you my team number, which is Gibson, Bryant, Williams Construction and Consultant Company, LLC. And let me get the phone number for you. You can take this down and you can reach out to the team and we'll tell you more about what's going on in the areas all over the United States and America, and Puerto Rico is included in this. So the phone number, you will call Harry Williams, and the phone number is 818-212-8117. That's 818-212-8117. And you can also private message me on Instagram and Twitter. Let's get the ball rolling. I was glad to be a part of this show, Diane. Good night to everybody else, Richard, Dennis, and others that may be listening in. I have another podcast, so I'm going to have to leave you all.
Okay, well, thank you so
Very
much.
glad to meet you, Derrick. Very,
Thank you.
my pleasure.
Great. So, Richard, do you have anything in closing?
Just that we have a tremendous opportunities to take places which are the centers of culture and of manufacturing and of development, and using them as scientific launch pads, both because of what the potential is and because people should not be consigned to live in some of the conditions that they're living in. I would say 50 million people in the United States are living in really terrible conditions, and don't need to. And it begins to solve there are international questions, as well as, of course, developing the continents of Africa, of Iberoamerica, and of Asia.
Okay, Dennis?
I guess the only thing I'd like to state, sort of taking off what Richie just said, is that the 50 million people who don't have to live that way represent the core of the solution of the problem. You look at households, look at the idea of 50 million jobs being provided to those households. You're talking about dealing with about 200 million Americans, and roughly that's about the number of people who are completely forgotten, including in that within the electoral seasons. So that's a way for us to address it. I think in terms of, Diane, your campaign and what you're trying to do, I think what people should think about in New York is the idea that if you can get a series of people, independent candidates in particular, who are talking about things like that and engaging the people to think about their own history. Because New York City, of course, is the reason that New York City was so central to America, which Alexander Hamilton and George Washington knew, is because of its manufacturing. That's why Hamilton's report on the subject of manufacturers was so important in New York, that it would not continue to be a plantation-like economy. Remember that Brooklyn, for example, used to provide the food for Haiti, which was a more advanced colony. And what Brooklyn was doing was, it was the slave plantations in Brooklyn provided food literally for the Haitian colony. So when you're looking at New York today, and people sort of think about it as being above agriculture or manufacturing, no, quite the contrary. It became what it became because Hamilton and others reversed the plantation systems. It took quite a bit of work to do that. And I think that what we're really talking about doing now is reversing the plantation system of debt slavery, which a lot of Wall Street's machinations have been responsible for. You have people who have, as everybody knows from their credit cards, massive amounts of debt, unpayable debt. And rather than try to pay all of this, I think it should be in effect frozen or canceled. You put people to work, and then real profit, real wealth gets generated. I don't think that's a partisan question. I think that New York City, New York State is a perfect place to start in the United States to rise above this idea of partisanship toward a notion of productivity. But it will take a new politics to do that. And independent candidacies, I think, are indispensable to that.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. I think we'll conclude, and actually I think we should plan another follow-up discussion, which we can figure out, because obviously there's a great deal to discuss in this regard. So with that, we'll conclude the live session, the New York Symposium, and I'll see you next week. Okay, the Facebook Live is over.
Great.
That was fun.
Yeah.
I had no idea that this thing has $500 billion in it.
I looked this up. I tried to get some, just to get some background so I would know. A couple of people said the figure, and I don't know. I'm just saying I don't really know.
Yeah, it's probably not that high. But
It's about 30 to 40 billion, at least in two articles I read.